Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, a massive offshore wind farm that was set to be built off the Brunswick County coast has been scrapped by the Trump administration. We'll get into all the details coming up. And a good Tuesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand by checking out the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app. You can also listen to the show online by, again, visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning brought to you by the Law Group here in Wilmington. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. We've got a very busy show for you today as there's a major announcement out of the Trump administration that will have an impact for coastal communities across the state of North Carolina as it relates to offshore wind. This has been a growing trend and a growing concern. We saw this a lot under the Biden administration, this attempt to bring forward unreliable, very expensive forms of electrical generation. The two most prominent, solar and wind. And I've made this point before, and I will continue to state this. There will likely be a time. How soon it will be, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend to know. There will be a time where solar and wind makes more practical sense. When the battery technology catches up, when it is much more cost effective to store that energy, obviously when the wind is not blowing, when the sun is not shining, there will be a time. It might be 10 years. It might be 30 years. I'm not immediately clear when that will be. It's not clear when that time period will take place, but there will come a time. That is an important part of this story. But I can say emphatically, without a doubt, that right now is not that time. The current lithium-ion battery technology that is used to store the energy that is created from solar, from wind, is just not there. The batteries are very expensive. They have relatively short lives. It's just not practical. And so under the previous administration, you saw this race to get as much solar and wind online as possible. This was all part of the Green New Deal, the Green New scam that was pushed by AOC and Joe Biden. This stuff was setting up a disaster for American citizens, for any U.S. consumer. Why? Because it was going to make your electrical bills skyrocket. All for what? So that Democrats can pat themselves on the back and claim that they're quote unquote saving the environment? So that they can pat themselves on the back and claim that they're fixing or stopping climate change? I mean, it's the biggest scam in the world. There is a process that can play out with renewable forms of energy. And I believe that there is and will be a greater place for renewable forms of energy. We just are not there yet. And I'm sorry, but I do not want my federal government or a state government or any government choosing and picking winners or losers as it relates to electricity generation. It just doesn't make any sense. It is bad for the electrical companies, and it's bad for the ratepayers. You are getting more expensive, more unreliable forms of electricity. And that just doesn't make, to me, any logical sense whatsoever. So under the Biden administration, you saw these leases continue to play out, and more particularly what we're talking about today, these offshore wind leases, where the Biden administration, through the Department of Energy and a couple of other agencies intertwined in this, were selling off these areas of land, essentially leasing these large acreages of land offshore for energy companies to build offshore wind farms. There has been a lot of objection to that, rightfully so, whether you're talking about some of the marine impacts as it relates to whales. You saw those headlines over the last couple of years, especially in portions of like New Jersey and Virginia, where whales were washing on shore dead. It's because of the mapping that they were using, the sonar mapping they were using to map out the ocean floor. It was disorienting the whales. They were running into ships and getting struck and killed and washing ashore. But of course, for the bleeding heart left, for the bleeding heart liberals, that was somehow not a major concern for them. Try that on for size. I have no idea how you can work yourself into that situation where you care so much about the environment that you're willing to let a bunch of right whales die so that you can map the ocean floor to put up a bunch of stupid wind turbines. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So let's get into the news. There's a couple of stories on this. So we're going to be reading a little bit from the New York Times. And the headline right off the bat is incredibly disingenuous. This is how it reads over at the New York Times. The Trump administration to pay $1 billion to energy giant to cancel wind farms. That's a pretty loaded headline. I would contend that point. I would say, wow, that's interesting. We're paying an energy company $1 billion not to build offshore wind. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, of course. Reading through the story, the Trump administration will pay the French energy giant Total Energies nearly $1 billion to abandon its plans to build wind farms off the East Coast, the Interior Department said on Monday at an energy conference in Houston. Under the unusual deal, Total Energies would forfeit its leases in federal waters for 2 wind farms, which would have been built off of New York and North Carolina. The Justice Department would then reimburse Total Energies $928 million, the amount it paid for the leases during the Biden administration. So you're going to see a lot of misinformation about this over the coming days. And I'm here to tell you that the Trump administration is not paying Total Energies $1 billion. They are reimbursing them the money that company had already paid for the leases. This is not writing a blank check to this energy company. They paid for the leases under the previous administration to explore and to build offshore wind. This administration understands what a disaster that is and has said, we're not going to go forward with that, and we're going to give you your money back. So this is not $1 billion worth of taxpayer monies being paid to this European energy company. It's just, it is at its face a lie. Even the headline over at the New York Times is just inaccurate. This is a reimbursement. This is refunding a company the money that they had paid to secure these 2 offshore wind projects. It in no way, shape, or form involves giving $1 billion worth of taxpayer monies to Total Energies. In exchange for the reimbursement for the money that they had already paid, Total Energies is set to invest that money in oil and gas projects in the United States, including a facility in Texas that would export liquefied natural gas to global markets. The company would also commit to producing more oil in the Gulf of America and said it was developing some additional gas-burning power plants to meet rising electricity demand from data centers. So from all accounts, just in the first 3 paragraphs into this New York Times article, this is a win-win-win. These disastrous offshore wind projects are being axed. Total Energies is getting the money back, which I would argue they deserve for paying for these leases that are no longer going to come to fruition. And the company is going to invest that into other forms of electrical generation and energy in the United States, like oil and gas. So the only losers in this story are the Green New Deal crowd. The only individuals that would be upset about this are people that are either A, being misled by the media to believe that this money is your dollars being paid to Total Energies, or B, individuals that have invested all of their political well-being into these very unreliable, very expensive forms of electrical generation. And that is the discussion that needs to take place. That is the real deal conversation that nobody is willing to have. These forms are not practical right now. Would they be practical in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Maybe. But that's not where we sit right here, right now. As we continue with this major announcement from the Trump administration that they are axing 2 major offshore wind projects that were set to be built on the United States East Coast. They were set to be built by French energy company Total Energies. Nearly $1 billion from that company is being returned to them as the leases have now been canceled, according to the Interior Department. That announcement coming out earlier this week. As I was mentioning, this is a major win for everybody involved. Now, the New York Times and other media outlets, including Politico, are, again, completely lying about this situation. The New York Times writes in their article, "This deal is an extraordinary transfer of taxpayer dollars to a foreign company for the purpose of boosting the production of fossil fuels, a main driver of climate change, while throttling offshore wind. It comes as the war in the Middle East has shocked global oil markets, prompting concerns about energy supplies." But the craziest thing about that is that just one paragraph earlier, the New York Times says, and I quote, "The Justice Department would reimburse Total Energies $928 million, the amount it paid for the leases during the Biden administration." So how is this being equated to a transfer of taxpayer dollars? Again, I'm not going to harp the entire show on this, but this is the New York Times in this article is completely manufacturing this point. And they are even admitting prior to this that it is the money that Total Energies had already paid to secure the leases. It would be no different than you buying a product from the store and returning it and getting your money back. You no longer have the product, but you have the original funds that you spent on it. This is exactly what we're talking about. You wouldn't call that an extraordinary transfer of Walmart's dollars to consumers. No, you're giving them their own money back. And that's exactly what's going on here. The New York Times first reported last week that the administration was considering the agreement. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum unveiled the deal earlier this week at a global energy conference in Houston, where he claimed that wind power was ineffective, which he is absolutely right to say. With Burgum telling the group, "The era of taxpayer-subsidized, unreliable, unaffordable, and unsecure energy is officially over. The era of affordable, reliable, and secure energy is here to stay." That is exactly what I want to hear out of this administration. For those that are not super familiar with how the process as it relates to electrical generation works, you need what is called baseload generation. And baseload is exactly what it sounds like. It is the base. It is the bottom of what you need to be able to generate, right? Regardless of whether it's the middle of the day or middle of the night, we all have appliances that are plugged in, refrigerators and freezers, HVAC systems, lamps, lights, all of our wonderful gadgets that we've got throughout our home that suck down electricity day in and day out. You've got what is called baseload electricity. What does that baseload or baseline look like? And the way that you generate for baseload is things like coal, nuclear, and natural gas. Things that are consistent, right? As long as you are burning natural gas, you are generating electricity. As long as you are burning coal, you are generating electricity. As long as the reactor is operating, you are generating electricity through a nuclear reactor. That is not the case with wind and solar. If it is not as sunny outside as it could be, inherently solar panels generate less electricity. That doesn't mean that they generate zero, but they generate less than their full potential. And it's the exact same thing with wind. If it is very windy out, then things are chugging along, everything is great. But when it's not windy, when those wind turbines are not spinning at their max capacity or at their full potential, you are not generating enough electricity. And so you can immediately see the problem that is created. The nice thing about dispatchable energy like nuclear, like coal, and like natural gas is that you can generate more and generate less. That's what makes them very reliable, secure forms of electricity, because you can inherently control what you're doing. If you need more energy from a nuclear reactor, you can spin it up or lower it down, what it's producing. Same thing with coal, same thing with natural gas. And we need that in our society, right? When you have a massive heat wave in the middle of the summer, you need to be able to make sure that you as an electrical grid operator or provider are pumping enough energy onto the grid to keep up with everybody's air conditioners running 24/7, which we are getting very close to here across the state of North Carolina. We're right down the barrel at those very humid, hot summer days. Same thing in the winter, when it's the dead of the winter and it's cold and everybody's heat pumps are running because very few people have furnaces here across the South. Very inefficient forms of generating heat. Your heat runs 24/7. Believe me, I saw my electrical bill over the winter months. It was brutal. You need to be able to generate that electricity on demand. And how do you do that with inherently unreliable forms of energy? And when I use that term unreliable, think about what I'm saying. They are inherently unreliable based on Mother Nature. If it's cloudy, less electricity is being generated by solar panels. If it's less windy, less is being generated by those turbines. Right? So right there, you've got a problem. And of course, at the same time, while this discussion is taking place, we need to talk about affordability. Wind and solar are stupid expensive. You think it's cheap to build a major wind farm 22 miles off the coast of Bald Head Island in southeastern North Carolina? You think it's cheap to run transmission lines that entire way all the way back to the mainland to get onto the grid? You think the maintenance is cheap on a wind farm that's sitting 22 miles off the coast? What happens when you've got a hurricane that rolls through? What's going to happen then? We're Hurricane Alley here in North Carolina, especially those that live in southeastern North Carolina. What does the long-term maintenance on that look like? What is the long-term the kind of geological impacts of pile driving steel beams into the ocean floor off the coast? And it's the same thing with solar. What happens when a hailstorm comes through and dents and cracks all the glass? What happens when you have days in the summer where it's overcast? You're not generating the same amount of electricity. And so all of these factors add up. The cost, the inherent lack of reliability, all of that adds up to forms of electrical generation that are just generally not that smart. It just doesn't make sense to shoehorn this kind of electricity onto the grid. The only reason it's being done, and the New York Times mentioned it in their article talking about climate change, that's the only reason you would shoehorn this stuff onto the grid. So that you can claim that you're green, that you're saving the earth, you're saving the environment. I think that's an incredibly stupid thing to say. And I think that's an incredibly stupid reason to bring these kinds of inherently very expensive, unreliable forms of electricity online. I am not in the business of virtue signaling or gaslighting. I am in the business of paying as little as possible for my utility bill. I am in the business of keeping as much of my money that I work for in my pocket and not shelling it out to Duke Energy and other companies so they can spin up a bunch of wind turbines and build a bunch of stupid freaking solar panels. That's not the business that I'm in. Maybe if you're some wacko environmental lefty, that's maybe the business that you're in. But guess what? The vast majority of the consumers are not. They're not interested in this stuff. They understand the real risks. They understand what happens when you no longer have these dispatchable forms of energy available during a heat wave, during a cold snap in the winter, during natural disasters. It's an incredibly stupid and I would argue very risky road to go down. We are talking about this major announcement from the Trump administration this week that they are axing two large offshore wind energy projects that were set to be built by Total Energies, which is a French energy company under the Biden administration. Total Energies spent somewhere in the ballpark of $1 billion to secure these two offshore leases, one off the coast of New York, the other off the coast of North Carolina. The Trump administration and Doug Burgum says the era of funding these very unreliable forms of electricity is over. The chief executive of Total Energies spoke to the New York Times this week and said, quote, "When the Trump administration came to power and began setting U.S. energy policy, we said that we'll have to reconsider clearly these offshore wind project developments." He said since winning the leases, the company had concluded that the offshore wind was, quote, "not the most affordable way to produce electricity." Hold on a second here. The New York Times, who in this article says this is a disaster, is quoting the chief executive of Total Energies, the French company, who says, quote, "offshore wind was not the most affordable way to produce electricity." The chief executive went on to say that it would require large amounts of federal subsidies that are now being phased out by the Trump administration. Right there should be all you need to know. I shouldn't even have to mention anything else. When you have the chief executive of a large global energy company saying, you know, this kind of generation, offshore wind, really isn't practical without a bunch of free government money. That should be the wink, wink, nod, nod that you need to understand what kind of a disaster this is. I mean, that is the most damning statement that could possibly be made. Yeah, this stuff doesn't really work all that well. And by the way, it's so ridiculously expensive. If the U.S. taxpayer doesn't give us a bunch of money to subsidize this stuff, then it really doesn't make sense for us to do it whatsoever. He went on to say, "To be clear, we do not renounce onshore wind and will continue to invest in onshore solar, onshore wind batteries, and more. But in the United States, offshore wind is, quote, too expensive from our point of view." That's it. That's all you need. Of course it's too expensive. You're building a massive wind farm 22 miles off the coast. That is going to cost a fortune. The maintenance is going to cost a fortune. You're going to have to drive or sail people out 50 miles round trip every time they need to work on something. Of course it's going to be expensive. Guess what? There's no electrical grid currently operating 22 miles off the coast of Bald Head Island. There isn't. So you've got to run these very expensive, either presumably underground cables back to the mainland to get this stuff onto the grid. Of course it's too expensive. You don't have to have a PhD to figure this out. It's as logical as you possibly could imagine. Late last year, the Trump administration tried to squash 5 wind farms in various stages of construction along the East Coast as it took dramatic steps of ordering a halt to construction for the projects, which had each received federal permits after years of review. The project's developers and several states sued. The federal judges ruled against the Trump administration in every case, so those projects continued. So the one that is of interest to us is called Carolina Long Bay. And it, as I mentioned, is set to be operated and it was set to be operated and built 22 miles almost due south of Bald Head Island, which for those that are not familiar with North Carolina's geography, Bald Head Island is right off the coast of Brunswick County in southeastern North Carolina. You take a ferry from Southport to get on over to Bald Head Island. That is the area. It is truly an island. Their only way to get to it is via ship. And so this was going to be built 22 miles south of Bald Head. And according to the New York Times, this Carolina Long Bay project could have powered around 300,000 homes and businesses starting in the early 2030s. So we were still multiple years away from this taking place. And of course, could have powered. This is, of course, under ideal conditions. But what happens when those ideal conditions aren't there. That has always been my pushback. That has always been my gripe with solar and wind. From a true technological standpoint, I think these forms of electricity are fascinating. From a purely technological standpoint, the fact that you can put out a solar array and generate electricity is amazing. The fact that you can put this big spinning blade in the air and generate electricity, that's amazing. That's a very cool technological feat. And just like we see with every other form of technology, the prices will continue to come down. The manufacturing costs will continue to come down. The maintenance will start to make more sense. It will become cheaper to maintain over time. There will come a point, and I feel confident saying this, that there will come a point where solar and wind make more sense. Now, at no point I think, at least in my lifetime, will they replace things like natural gas and nuclear. I don't think there's any likelihood of that happening. But I can say that 20 years down the road, as the technology continues to mature, as battery technology continues to get better, there might be a legitimate conversation that should take place over, does it make sense to build another nuclear plant here, or does it make sense to put up a solar farm or a wind farm? I'm open to that conversation. I'm not saying I'm going to fully agree with it. I'm not saying that I'm going to give it a check of approval right now. I'm not going to, but I'm willing to have the discussion. I'm willing to have the conversation. And see, that is what makes the left and right continually different on a variety of issues. I'm willing to listen. And I've had plenty of debates and listened to plenty of discussions and read plenty of white papers on this debate over forms of electricity. I'm not afraid of wind and solar. I don't think that they're the stupidest thing that's ever been done. The part that I think is stupid, the issues that I have with it, is that it is being chosen over what we know to be more reliable and more affordable forms of energy. That's the part of this that's so stupid, because the technology is not there yet, because it has not matured to a point where it makes sense to put these massive projects on the grid. And the reason that you've seen such a big build out in solar and wind over the last couple of years is because of what the CEO of the French energy company said. It's because of subsidies. And let's be clear with what subsidies are. They are your dollars that you pay to the state, local, and federal government being sent to companies for them to build, in this case, wind and solar farms, for them to then sell that electricity to Duke and other providers for you to pay for it in your various electricity bills. That's the process that plays out here. Government subsidies are almost always, and I'm using that word clearly, almost always a disaster. Almost every single time. And I can say without a doubt, without a question, as it relates to electrical generation, which are, of course, ratepayer systems. The only reason that Duke Energy can make any money is because businesses and you and me and everybody else is paying for electricity. It's a ratepayer, in the case of North Carolina, a rate limited entity through the North Carolina Utilities Commission. So what makes the most sense? Building up forms of electricity that are more reliable and more affordable for the ratepayers, or going all in on things that we know inherently have a large level of reliability concerns and constraints, and of course, cost a fortune. It turns out purchasing hundreds of acres of land, littering it with a bunch of solar panels from China, and building up a bunch of substations nearby doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. And it's the same thing with wind. Turns out chugging all these wind turbines 22 miles offshore and essentially building a city off the coast of Bald Head Island doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This is a major win for the ratepayer, and I would argue this is a major win for the United States of America. No question about it. This stuff has been incredibly stupid. It remains incredibly stupid. The risks do not outweigh the benefits in any of this. Of course, unless you are of the mindset that the earth is on fire, that everything is crumbling in front of our very eyes, that the only solution forward is to drive electric vehicles and get all of our power from wind and solar, or the earth is going to spontaneously combust due to climate change. I don't subscribe to that notion. I don't subscribe to that idea because it's stupid and it's not based in any sort of science or fact or reality or anything like that. It is just feeling. People feel like this is a good idea. So this is an interesting situation that we're continuing to watch unfold. We'll grab a quick break and I'll have some additional details on that. Plus get to some of your comments coming up here in just a couple of minutes. I want to remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in the law group right here in Wilmington. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of North Carolina. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense. If so, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, ladies and gentlemen. They're located in downtown Wilmington and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online at lawgroupnc.com. We appreciate the Law Group, Melissa Gott, and her team for their continued support of the Nick Craig Show. All right, we'll grab a quick break. I'll round up this discussion on this major win for the ratepayers and tourists and everybody here in North Carolina as the Trump administration has axed two major offshore wind projects scheduled for the eastern seaboard. I'll have those details coming up as the Nick Craig Show continues, streaming live this morning, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Thanks for spending some time with us today as we cover this major announcement out of the Trump administration, a huge win for those in southeastern North Carolina, those in portions of New York. Two major offshore wind projects that were leased under the Biden administration as part of the Green New Deal, the Green New scam to build these massive offshore wind projects have been scrapped. And while I am in favor of this. Many of you are in favor of this. Surprise, surprise, the two Democrat governors in both New York and North Carolina are not happy. We'll start in New York, where Governor Kathy Hochul criticized the deal in a statement saying, quote, using a pay not to play scheme to pressure a company not to build offshore wind is an outrageous abuse of taxpayer dollars. She went on to say, I remain committed to moving forward with my all of the above approach that includes renewables, nuclear, and other energy sources needed to keep the lights on and costs down. Once again, I will bring you this point. No taxpayer dollars are being expensed on this. The nearly $1 billion that the United States is paying to Total Energies is the money that that company paid to secure the leases. You are simply giving them their money back. They paid for the leases. The projects have been canceled. I think it's only fair to give them the money back. It's not their fault that the administration changed. It's not their fault that the Biden administration thought that it was a good idea to build these ridiculously stupid, unreliable, expensive forms of electrical generation. So why would they not get their money back? I mean, that's just totally logical to me. Following that up, Governor Josh Stein had the pretty similar comment saying, quote, our state has the offshore wind potential to power millions of homes with renewable American-made energy. False. He said it is ludicrous and wasteful that the Trump administration is spending $1 billion in taxpayer money to pay off a company to stop it from investing private dollars to create clean energy that we need. Well, Governor Stein, a couple of things wrong with your comment. This was not going to power millions of homes. I went directly to the Carolina Bay website. Total Energies set up a website where they were promoting this project and had some information about this project. And it is an absolute lie that millions of homes were set to receive power from this. It's just not the case. The best prediction, the best thought from this entity would that it would power somewhere in the ballpark of 300,000 homes. That's not just my thought on it. That is exactly what Carolina Long Bay and Total Energies has on their website, reading directly from their site. Once complete, Total Energies Carolina Long Bay will generate more than 1 gigawatt of power, equivalent to powering 300,000 homes from an 86 square nautical mile wind farm 22 miles off the coast of North Carolina. So, in fact, this project would not have powered millions of homes. That is a lie from Governor Josh Stein. He then goes on to say that it's ludicrous that the Trump administration is spending $1 billion worth of taxpayer money, which of course is not true. The New York Times admitted this at the beginning of their article, saying the money that is going to be given back to Total Energies is $927 million, which is what they paid for the leases off the coast of North Carolina and off of New York. And then his final point, create clean energy that we need. Governor Stein, we don't need it. We have ways to generate electricity very cleanly. It's called SMR, small modular reactors. They are being built by GE in North Carolina. GE Hitachi is building these SMRs, these small modular nuclear reactors, right here in the Tar Heel State. You want to talk about clean energy? That's your solution. We're not talking about the nuclear reactors of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We're talking about facilities that are about the size of a football field that can power hundreds of thousands of homes in a very small footprint. And in many cases, on the former sites of coal and natural gas plants, where guess what? There's already infrastructure. There's already high tension power lines. There's already substations where you don't have to trench 22 miles of cable to get the electricity back to the coast. Turns out there's no such thing as wireless energy. So you're not going to be able to build this this wind farm 22 miles off the coast of Bald Head Island and magically just have the energy appear on shore. No, you've got to trench and run 22 miles of plus of cable to make that happen. So no, Governor Stein, none of what you say in your statement is accurate whatsoever. This is political gaslighting at its absolute worst. Not at its finest, at its absolute worst. The arguments that are being made by individuals like Kathy Hochul, like Governor Josh Stein, like all of these others on the political left, these green new energy individuals, are just not based in any sort of fact or reality. They're just not. And you can look at some of the white papers and some of the briefings on this. It's blatantly obvious what this would have caused. It would have caused rates to jump through the roof because, again, these forms of electricity are very expensive. These very unreliable forms of electricity cost a fortune to build. They cost a fortune to maintain. I would argue they're very environmentally disastrous as you're pile driving steel beams into the ocean floor. We've seen the result of that in the Northeast with all of the right whales washing up dead on shore, being disoriented from all the sonar that is being used to map the ocean floor. There is so much against these projects. It is genuinely a little bit surprising to me, not completely surprising, but it's at least a little bit surprising to me that those on the political left are continuing to push this narrative because nobody really wants this. When you ask people, even those that call themselves, environmentalists and whatnot, what do they really want when the rubber meets the road? They don't want to spend $700 on the utility bill every month. Now, some of them might be willing to do that because their political identity is more of a religion than anything else. But I think the vast majority of them want reliable, affordable electricity. And by the way, and I haven't mentioned this yet, North Carolina law requires that we are purchasing the most affordable, least cost energy. That was the big debate last year, which we covered here on this show, about the Carolina Carbon Plan, which had an interim goal of 2030 that the General Assembly axed during the General Assembly long session in 2025. Because it was expected that ratepayers would bear the brunt of billions of dollars worth of additional expenditures due to these projects. And so all of this combined, hopefully you are able to wrap your head around why this stuff doesn't make any sense right now. Again, might it make sense 10, 15, 20 years down the road? Maybe. We'll retouch the issue then. We can have the legitimate debate at that point. But if we're having a debate on this right now in 2026, it is clear and obvious to me that this is not the path forward. It is clear and obvious to me that shoehorning in and subsidizing unreliable, very expensive forms of electricity is not the smartest path forward. It's just not. I don't care what you think about climate change. I don't care what you think about the earth is going to explode and global warming is going to kill everybody. Those are emotional arguments. They're not based in any sort of fact, not based in any sort of reality or anything of that nature. It is political gaslighting. It is a political attempt to subsidize these forms of electricity. We saw it with the Green New Deal under the Biden administration. Thankfully, under this Trump administration, we are seeing the rollback. We are seeing Doug Burgum. We are seeing Lee Zeldin over at EPA rolling this garbage back that is only going to make my life and your life more expensive and more of a headache when you need to turn on your air conditioning in the middle of August and whoops, it's a little cloudy outside. Sorry, we don't have enough electricity on the grid, so we're going to put you into a rolling brownout. Phenomenal idea, ladies and gentlemen on the left. I didn't sign up for this stuff. I'm not interested in it. Props to Doug Burgum. Props to the Trump administration for gutting this garbage as they should have. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Plain and simple. I'm not, there's nothing else to debate. There's no other conversation to be had. That is the cold, hard reality of this situation. So looking at a little bit more of the project, here is the proposed plan, or this was the lease that was given out by the Bureau of Energy Management to the Total Energies company, that French company. And you can see this very large area just off the coast of Bald Head Island, about 22 miles off the coast of Bald Head Island, that people in southeastern North Carolina were rather annoyed about. Can you blame them? Man, it must be nice looking out into the ocean to see a bunch of wind turbines sticking up over the horizon, which is exactly what you would see. I caught this article over at the John Locke Foundation that showed the size of these facilities. They're huge. The turbines planned off the Brunswick County coast would have been 853 feet tall when all said and done. That's taller than the PNC Plaza building in Raleigh. It's way taller than the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. It's about the same height as the Bank of America building in Charlotte, which, by the way, is North Carolina's tallest buildings. And same thing with the turbines planned off of Kitty Hawk, which is under a completely different lease and different structure. Those things would be over 1,000 feet tall. Who wants this? Who wants to look off the coast and see a bunch of freaking wind turbines blowing around in the ocean? Who? Bunch of environmental leftists? A bunch of individuals that don't understand basic electrical generation concepts? I mean, this stuff is not overly complicated. I don't have a background in energy, but you can very clearly figure this stuff out. You need to be able to generate baseload electricity. You cannot do that with these forms of energy. In all of my time following this and talking to some of the experts, one of the best is John Sanders over at the John Locke Foundation. This stuff is just completely illogical. It's in search of something that doesn't exist. Great comment coming in on our Rumble live chat. Climate science is a luxury belief. Oh, absolutely it is. And that's who, of course, you're seeing push this stuff. Some other comments coming in. I can only imagine the scene with windmills and a hurricane. I mean, logical would tell you that, yeah, probably putting a bunch of 900 feet tall wind turbines off the coast of Brunswick County, which is Hurricane Alley, is probably not the smartest idea. Can you imagine a strong Category 2, Category 3, or God forbid, a 4 or 5 hurricane rolling through that area, which, by the way, that is a common track that hurricanes take when they're approaching the North and South Carolina coast? You imagine the devastation that would face? And guess who'd pay for it? Not Total Energy, you and I. Because they'd go crying to the federal government that their wind turbine farm got destroyed by a natural disaster, and they'd get a bunch of federal money to rebuild it. And again, in the meantime, during all of this, you and I are paying for it anyway. Because once these forms of electricity get onto the grid, your power bill goes up. Your power becomes inherently less reliable. I'll end on this. All for what? So a bunch of Democrats can pat themselves on the back and claim that they are solving or stopping climate change. I'm not interested in entertaining any part of that conversation whatsoever. This is a major win for the Trump administration, a major win for common sense as it relates to energy policy. We'll keep an eye on this. I'm sure that there will be additional reaction. This story just broke yesterday and throughout last night, so it's a relatively new story. You're hearing it here first on the Nick Craig Show. We'll keep you up to date with the reaction as it continues to come in. Well, that's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the program. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, also available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app. You can hear the program weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. That's going to do it. We're back here tomorrow morning on the Nick Craig Show.